Welcome, teacher friend. I'm Lori.
And I'm Melissa.
We are two literacy educators in Baltimore. We want the best for all kids, and we know you do too.
Our district recently adopted a new literacy curriculum, which meant a lot of change for everyone. Lori and I can't wait to keep learning about literacy with you today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Melissa and Lori Love Literacy Podcast. We are thrilled that you're here with us today because we have a former teacher who now works for Great Minds. And I know she's got a big fan base following from InSync. I was on a call yesterday with a school district and they were raving about her. So I cannot wait for you all to hear her voice today.
I knew Sarah Webb's name from just the articles and things like that. So she's one of those famous teachers.
She's kind of famous. Yeah. I fangirled about her a little bit. I think she wrote a piece. I forget for what. Was it Education? Sarah, what was it? Jump in. Education Weekly?
Yeah, I've written a few things. I had a lot of blogs on Achieve the Core about wisdom. That got a few things.
Yeah. I remember reading them, and then I met you, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, that's the girl from who's famous from the blog." And I was so excited, but then I didn't want to, sound like I was too excited to meet you. So, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so Sarah, tell us about yourself. We know you're a former teacher, but give us a little bit of context. We're all former teachers here, so.
Right. Former teacher and never expected to be a famous teacher. So I take that, that I don't take lightly. And I don't think I'm, that famous, but I was an elementary school teacher. I taught all the subjects, as we do, and then switched over to only doing English language arts. So I taught ELA in fourth grade for a long time. And I was part of a pilot when my district piloted Wit and Wisdom. So that's how I got involved. So I taught that in fourth grade and then made a switch to be an English learner teacher in middle school. Overcame my fear of seventh graders and ended up
they're not too scary.
It. Yeah, I was really scared at first, but turns out they are just as endearing as any other kid, in their special ways. So then I taught English language learners in 5th through 8th grade, and I helped them with all kinds of things. Obviously did some English language development, but also did a lot of support in their Wit and Wisdom classrooms. My whole district was using the curriculum at that point. So I got this really huge overview of Wit and Wisdom, like seeing it from 4th all the way through 8th grade. And then was really lucky to get this job working for Great Minds and working for Wit and Wisdom as a senior curriculum designer, really looking at how can we improve our supports for multilingual learners. So that's where I am now.
Now you're famous, and I'm going to tell a quick story before, thank you for that, before we go into the podcast, we go into a little bit more, because I want to dive into a lot of what you just shared. But I was on a call yesterday with a school district, and for those of you who are just listening to the podcast, they very endearingly referred to Sarah as Joanna Gaines, because she kind of has a Joanna Gaines vibe. So if you're listening, you can picture in your head Joanna Gaines as Sarah Webb as Joanna Gaines, and just know that she has beautiful
that's
long
so
hair
funny.
like Joanna Gaines.
That is not the first. Of course, I don't see that at all. But that is not the first time someone has said that. My husband works with someone, and when they met me, they're like, "Yeah, like your wife, like who looks like Joanna Gaines," And I was like, I Googled her, like I look like her? So that's funny. That's a great
that's a great compliment.
When I post the podcast, I should do one of those side by sides, like your headshot and Joanna Gaines's headshot.
Definitely.
Now everybody has a fabulous visual. So when you're talking, they can picture.
Yes, absolutely.
That is too funny. All right, Sarah. So tell us a little bit about your journey with Wit and Wisdom.
Yeah.
You were teaching before you started that pilot of Wit and Wisdom.
Yeah.
What was the transition from, and how did it go?
Yeah, it's my true confessional time, right? Like, I have to make the confession that, I was for balanced literacy, and I used leveled reading, and I had the groups and, the kids in groups, and some kids read this book and some kids read that book. And I I loved those kids and I was working so hard. I was trying to do everything for them and I saw growth in different ways, but I was always trying to find, a better way. What else could I be doing? And, I've listened to you guys a lot. So I know, you've been down this road and, and you're honest, and it's important for us to all, be vulnerable and say we've all made mistakes. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And also
we didn't know it was a mistake.
We didn't know it was a mistake. Yeah. And some of the stuff, even when we were doing it, it didn't make 100% sense, but you're like, oh, I trust this because this is what somebody who's older and wiser than me is giving me. But how can you teach books when you haven't even read the book?
I have to read a quote I read this morning because it's exactly this. It's forgive yourself for not having the foresight to know what now seems obvious in hindsight.
Oh, thank you, Melissa. Exactly. So then my district, piloted Wit and Wisdom, and it was actually a different school. Not even my school was going to do it, but then they started asking a few other people, and we had recently started Common Core, recently started the new test for Common Core, and I had kind of said to the curriculum department, like, oh my gosh, what's going on with my test scores? We need to do something different. And so they said, hey, do you want to be part of this pilot? And as soon as I saw Wit and Wisdom, I was like, oh, thank God, somebody figured it out, right? This is great. And so it wasn't it was hard for me at the beginning, but it wasn't as long necessarily of maybe a love relationship. I feel like I kind of dove in from the beginning because I was just these are things I've wanted, right? Lots of text together and rich text. And, so the design of it was, I was on board with that because I felt like it was just beautiful the way it was crafted. I was wondering, how is this going to work for my students who are usually struggling, right? Because they have struggled in easier text, right? Or, different things we've done. Yeah. And so that was what was just huge, right? That I could not believe the path that I saw them take throughout this year, as I'm learning to use this curriculum. And that was absolutely the most motivating part for me to keep diving in each night, okay, what are we doing tomorrow? Right? How are we, let's take some time to figure this out, because I just really realized how aware they were that they had been struggling, right? They were fourth graders, they were 9, but they absolutely knew, right? I read these books, that kid gets to read a bigger book, right? And what that really does to them and their attitude about reading and their attitude about school. And so to all of a sudden be really they just knew, oh my gosh, I am getting to do what everybody else does. This teacher believes that I can do that, right? That just really changes their perspective about themselves. And I had shared this story, how I really got mildly famous, thanks to Natalie Wexler, because I had shared this story with her about one of my students. And he was new because my school is near a military base. So there was a lot of moving in and out all the time. And so he was new this year, and his mom had, said to me at the very beginning, expressed concerns, he's struggled with reading, he's one of those struggling readers, right? That term that we use for better or worse. And after the first month of school, she was like, I can't believe this. We had been studying the Great Heart, and we'd read these articles about Clara Barton and different women who showed great heart. And he had just written this whole paragraph, right? Because he had actually learned about something really interesting that he really loved, that challenged him and fascinated him, right? And then he just couldn't help just writing about it. And he was so proud. It's the most he'd ever written. And she told me he came home and he made his family sit down, said, I'm going to read this to you, what I wrote at school today, and read all this information about Clara Barton. And she was just from a mom, how it feels as a mom to think finally my kid is excited about something in school and feels like they are being successful, because that's what we want, right? We just want our kids to feel successful and feel like they're really doing something. So yeah. And it was exponential growth, right? For kids like him, it was once they just got that little spark, sure, he still needed help, right? Sometimes he still needed help, and he really, I should have done more for, intervention for him for decoding, because he did need that still, but but he also needed this, and he wasn't getting that from the leveled reading. And so he ended up moving after that year again. And then when I reached out to her when the book came out, when, Natalie was like talking about him, these articles and the knowledge gap and everything. And I was like, hey, like, we're in the book, and she said, thank you again. And this is awesome. And she said that after they had moved and he still was sort of struggling, they did get him tested and he was, diagnosed with dyslexia. So he did start getting more intervention, that really helped his needs. But, she still said, like, there's never been a year where he has been more engaged in school. So to me, that was just like the power of engagement. Like, I saw it translate into products, like right into higher quality writing and into engagement in reading and more reading and eventually test scores, right? I mean, all those things happen, but like the spark was just them getting that engagement with the text, like the actual like struggle but they felt like it was worthy, right? It wasn't just like, oh, here's this book, it's boring, the teacher doesn't have to read it, right? It was like, here's something great I want you to really engage with. So
yeah.
I find it so interesting because when we did the review, we were looking for curricula. There were so many people who said like, well, this will be great for our students who are like on grade level or close, but no way will our struggling students be able to read this. And I just find it so interesting because we hear stories like this one often that, we assume, oh, they're going to hate this because it's too hard. Mm-hmm. And in fact, like you find your story is just the opposite.
Right.
Because we're honoring them as learners and we're not like, I'm thinking of, a one little boy in particular, just like you are, Sarah, just like that story made you think of a student. The little boy used to say like, I'm in the stupid class. Mm-hmm. And when we transitioned to giving grade level stuff, he no longer said that and felt honored in his learning. And I think it's about honoring students as learners and giving them what they deserve and what they need. Like, so I'm looking at, Sarah shared a resource. And Sarah, I want to also talk about what you said in terms of that both and, like, it's not just about decoding or content.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking.
But, Sarah did share a resource to like put this in perspective for us from English Learner Success Forum. And what I think is really interesting in this resource, and I'll link it in the notes, in the show notes, is that like when you think about two examples of excerpts from texts, can I read them? Anybody mind?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
So these are two short excerpts from texts about raptors and their prey. And the first one goes like this. Owls are birds of prey. They catch rats and mice. They have good eyes. They can see in the dark. They hunt at night. They have sharp claws. They are good hunters. And the second excerpt goes like this. Imagine you are a small animal minding your own business, scurrying low to the ground, going about your day. Suddenly, you sense that something is watching you. You look around, but you don't see anything. Scary, isn't it? So when you think about those two excerpts, like, and they call it out as intellectual richness and interestingness of the text, like B, essentially, right? A is really short sentences. It's not really linking the information together. It's just like choppy and divided. But the second excerpt is much more rich. And you can like really infer the connections between the sentences. And when you think about what kids deserve and what would be more interesting to read, like it's kind of a no-brainer. And that's where I think I struggle a lot in being like, seeing lots of kids exposed to that first excerpt. That's not going to help them be better readers or writers. And it's the same content,
Well, and if I could get like really nerdy for a second, and if you think about Scarborough's rope, right? And the two sides, like the foundational skills or the simple view of reading, like you have the foundational skills and that's so important, right? To actually learn how to decode words. Like you need that, right? We get that.
100, yeah.
You also have the language comprehension side. And I think that the idea of guided reading is like, we're just trying to do something in the middle, but we actually end up doing neither of those things, right? Like we're like, well, if we do grade level text, that's too hard. And so we think we're like going down to their like foundational levels, but we're really not instructing them in phonics, right? Like we're just like having them read something easy, but we've also taken away all the richness of the language that's building their language comprehension. So it's like we were trying to like kill two birds with one stone, but I think we ended up doing neither, right? Like we weren't really hitting either side of those. And so that's where, if you get a really grade level rich program like Wit and Wisdom, which obviously I'm an advocate for, but there are others, right? Then you really hit that language comprehension because you're building vocabulary, building knowledge, exposing them to the complex sentences like the second example. But you also need the other part, right? And so even my fourth graders who if they were not reading fluently by then, which sure, there were plenty of them that weren't, right? Now they were able to engage in that rich conversation and discussion and, reading with supports. Sure, I had to support them sometimes. But then what they needed instead of just an easier book was they really needed that target intervention in decoding, in fluency, like it just, you have to really understand how those things can be separate. And like, unfortunately, I think like the leveled and guided reading, like really doesn't address either side of that, even though it's sort of trying to be the bridge. And that is what it was so interesting is once I had sort of realized that, and then I made this shift into the world of multilingual learners, just because I always loved languages and, kind of was like, let me try something new. I really saw this same idea, like there's this idea in it, which I think is a little old fashioned, but is still really prevalent, that you need to learn a certain level of English before you can engage in a grade level classroom, right? So, I mean, some students certainly come to kindergarten and are, learning English from kindergarten, but kids come in all different grades, right? With different proficiency levels. And so when I got a fifth grade student who had just moved here from another country, and he's entering fifth grade for the first time in America. And there's a lot of thought, a lot of people who said like, well, he should just go learn English, right? Like, we'll just pull him out, please. Like, he certainly can't do this. Like, pull him out and teach him English. And then, when he's ready, like I will teach him the fifth grade stuff. But
he might not be ready for like years and years and years. And by then he might be like 18.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's, all the research about how long, it takes 5 to 7 years to really master academic language. So yeah, like, what are you going to just keep him out all that time? And then it's sort of the same thing that like, yes, he needs that English, certainly he benefited from some small one-on-one time with me of like, here's how you ask to go to the bathroom, right? And like, here's how the lunch line worked. I mean, that's all important. And we did some basic conversation, but he still needed that content. It's like, he still needed that balance, that both and of like the content, first of all, is keeping him on grade level because he went to school in another language. Like, he can think as a fifth grader, he can access that, like that content, even if maybe he needs some of it in Spanish for right now, or maybe, like he needs it in a little bit different way, with lots of visuals and lots of help, and he will get there. And he will, there's also a ton of research that says he will learn English faster by being so engaged in content, right? And giving him something meaningful to talk about will also help him learn the academic words, right? And the school words, because he's going to learn how to say like, hey dude, what's up? I mean, he's going to get that from recess, right? From playing Foursquare at recess. Like, but he needs to know how to say, for example, the text said, right? And like, he could be learning that right now, just as fast as, like, give me back my ball or something. So, so it's always like integrating all of those things, like having the both and is so important. And it was really interesting to like, I just felt like I was fighting like the same battle again, like when I moved over to like the world of English learners, like, no, like we all do this now. Like, let everybody in.
It's messy. It's not like a clean straight line of like, first they need this and then they need that. Cause like you made a very excellent point. This child went to school and was able to understand in another language up to the point of fifth grade. So it's not like we're starting in infancy and not right. Like that's, And I always wonder, like, why do more parents not question this? Cause when you think about yourself as a parent, I mean, I didn't just read books that Presley could understand when she was to her when she was 2 and 3. We read lots of books that were very rich, that were very engaging, but not just ones. Of course, we read the ones she could understand. Point to the red block, point to the blue block, find the green circle. But then we also read lots of other rich books. We're reading Madeline. You're reading lots of books that are engaging them in rich literacy experiences so that they can, see other things and experience other things, but also feel connected and also hear the language and the vocabulary. So to me,
that's what I was going to say. There's the oral part of it too, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is so important, right? So important for English learners. And your point, like Lori, to go back to the other part with, the 2 example of the raptors, what's so interesting too, for English learners is we don't talk in those short, like stilted phrases. So sometimes that can be really helpful for if you're really focusing on just decoding and reading it and, beginning foundational skills. Sure, you need, sometimes just more clear text that you can practice things, or you're working on pronunciation. But if that's all they hear, that also gives them a weird sense of like what English is, right? Or
Yeah.
I didn't even think about that.
That's not how people talk. And that's not what they're going to continue to expose, to get to. And it's interesting. There's like a lot of studies that, especially for English learners, again, like so similar to struggling readers, like people always, with English learners, they really hone in on foundational skills stuff, right? They're like, oh, well, they can't, it's like, since they can't like communicate, it really goes into like, we need to do foundational reading, which isn't always true because they're learning to like speak, right? Like in a whole new language. It's like, they really need that language comprehension side because they don't even have the oral vocabulary. And when they never hear complex text, like they never get like what they need, right? Like to actually move forward. So it's like, even if they do learn to decode really well, then they're kind of like stuck because they've never even heard like the more advanced vocabulary, because they've been kind of just like stuck in that beginning level. And the parent side, I think parents want to trust teachers, right? And it's like, we're trying to educate more parents to know what their teachers, what their teachers should be doing, what their kids need, but that's really hard. And thinking, specifically about like multilingual students, like in other cultures, especially, like teachers are even more respected, not to say they're not always respected here, but like they are more respected. And so, if you're a parent who is not super comfortable speaking in English and you come from a culture that's more, the teachers are more sort of revered, you're not going to ask like, why is my kid reading that? Like that's just,
that's a really good
point. It's really hard to speak up, and so that's why I think I got even like more fired up about it, like working in the multilingual learner world. Because I'm like, these kids and families, like they literally can't always advocate for themselves, right? Because they can't communicate, what they're trying to, how they might be feeling. But I was able to see, so much success that inspired me, like this student, right? The 5th grader that came in, no words at the beginning. Like we would walk around the school, like door, you know what I mean? But like hallway, lunch. And it was just fabulous to watch him grow. And so I remember he was doing, like halfway through the year, he's doing a mix and mingle, which a teacher could be quick to say, oh, you don't have to do that, right? Because that's getting up, talking to other kids, a lot of interaction. And they might, it would be easier for some teachers to say, you just wait till this is over. But I was there. I'm like, come on, let's do this. And so I was, of course, like, it's really helpful if you have a lot of support for your school for English learners. That's a whole other podcast, right? About like federal funding of programming. But I was there to help him. And I had some Spanish skills that I could talk to him and be like, okay, like we're talking about the Nez Perce, like, let's do this. And ask him, get his opinion. And so we practiced, like he told me what he wanted to say. I helped him say it in English. We wrote on a little Post-it. He practiced saying it to me. Right. So then he got up and he could go say, I mean, even though he had to just read it, like, I think, right. But he said it to the other kid. The kid's like, wow, like so excited. Like, look, he's talking English. Like the kids are like, they love it, right? Like it's like magic to them. Like when they watch someone just learn English throughout the year, because this was a pretty new experience, in my district. And then, like a couple months later, when he stands up and volunteers an answer in the Socratic seminar, right? And everyone in the class claps, like claps for him, like
Aww.
What a moment for that whole class to be like they all just felt so like responsible for him, right? And like so proud to like join in his success. So it was just so cool that they all had that experience, and he was able to do it, right? Like he was able to get as much as he could like out of that like really challenging curriculum.
I have goosebumps. I love that. And you've told me this story before, so that's
well, and the best part about like since I was working across middle school, right? So then I kept working with him in 6th grade and 7th grade. So I got to follow him, and it's like watching your own kids grow up. Like it's just fantastic. Like I got to see him, so first I like watch him like go from like beginning 5th grade, of course, then like later he's like getting girlfriends, just like all of the stuff, just growing up. But then also, so like he comes in 5th grade and no words, right? And then he's like, can write something and say it to someone. Then he can speak to the whole class. And then like in 6th grade, he wrote a whole paragraph, right? About bud, not buddy, with evidence from the text, like, just all this stuff. And sure, there was still support, right? And sure, he wasn't comprehending every single word of the text, but he was getting a lot. And I feel like he was just learning faster, being interested in what was happening, right? Both content and language. And then, into 7th grade, and there he is like talking about Animal Farm, right? I mean, it's just crazy to like watch
the through line of
progress.
identity in 7th grade. I'm picturing him just being like, oh, wow, that directly impacts him, like that.
Yeah.
That concept. So this speaks volumes in terms of pull in versus push out.
Yes.
Because if he were pulled out, what would he get, Sarah Webb?
I mean, it would be like a lot of pull-out programs, I think, are just usually a separate curriculum, right? Like I think about it like, did you guys take foreign languages in high school? Did you take like French or Spanish? And you had like that book, and it would be like, okay, this week we're doing like sports words, right?
Yeah, I know, it was awful. It was awful.
And like, I mean, I loved it. I loved French class. I took it forever and ever in college and everything,
I mean, that's Spanish. So good. I feel like I never really got it.
But I had different experiences. Yeah, because I took French forever in school. And then I went like from 6th grade, because I'm from Vermont, so we're weird. We take French instead of Spanish. We're like right next to Canada. So I took French from 6th grade all the way through college. And then all of a sudden I went to France and I was like, oh my God, I still can't talk to these people, right? Because I've just been doing like workbooks all this time. I mean, I did more, but still it was different. Because it was very like separated, like we are learning French language now. And then when I did Spanish, I did like a more immersive program where it was like a mix, more of a both and of like, we have time where we learn the language, but then we also just have tons of opportunities to learn it, to practice it. And it just personally, I had that like so much, it was so much more effective. And I don't want to just count on my experiences, right? There's a lot of research that backs that up. And then I've seen that, with my kids, that if they're pulled out, they're just learning things out of context. They're just learning words, but then they don't get to like practice them. I mean, it's the same thing as when you just try to teach a kid a word and then, or like the spelling test, right? It's kind of like the old spelling test where you just practice the words for Friday and then you forget, right? So if you never do things in context, it just doesn't stick. Yeah. And so
schemata.
Yeah.
Schemata.
Yeah. And so the pull in, the pull out, I mean, that's always a thing. And again, I think just like there's a place for decoding fluency intervention, like there's a place for newcomers to learn how to say bathroom, right? And like to just get the intricacy of I am versus you are. I mean, you can certainly have some explicit time on that, but it should never be at the expense of the grade level content, right? Like it always has to be like the both and. And so the pull out could be an intervention time, right? But it shouldn't be instead of the language arts classroom. And my district, I will say, like, they were really committed to that when we did Wisdom. They did say, hey, like, they bought in, like, everybody has to be in here. And I think that's why we saw, the results that we did. I mean, we did end up seeing test scores and that kind of stuff, in addition to the just great things that were happening, that we saw actual, the success with kids.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you saw other parts of the curriculum itself. Like, are there any other things that were happening in the curriculum that you think supported your English learners specifically?
Well, the text selection, like, I always loved that. I mean, because there was a lot of things that, like, spoke to my kids, those big topics about, identity. And, but I also loved, and so then the way that the topics go for so long, right? And the vocabulary that's just repeated over and over, and those opportunities for deep dives where it's like, okay, we're going to deep dive into this word inspire and the parts and other words it's related to, but then we're also going to use this, like, every day for 3 weeks, right? So that, like, the time to, like, really zoom in on words and language, but then also the constant repetition of it was super helpful. And the other thing that I thought was really helpful for my students, I always saw, was, like, the writing support, like, the way that there was, like, so we're writing about the content, right? So we've talked about it a ton because the oral rehearsal is so important, but then we fill it out in a graphic organizer. So we have all this evidence collected and we've talked about it, right? We're ready to think about this. And then there was really support for, like, okay, this is how you organize your paragraph. This is how you organize your essay, because those things actually can vary. Like, it's weird, but, like, vary culturally as well. And just, just to understand, like, really explicitly, okay, like, this is how I write a paragraph. That kind of stuff was so helpful. And then having that, like, the consistency of curriculum, right? So, like, they had this way to write a paragraph in 5th grade that then was the same thing that teachers referring to in 6th grade and 7th grade and 8th grade. So that was so powerful. So I thought the writing was really helpful, and the way that there was so much, like, oral processing of the content so that they could kind of develop the words that they needed to say, right, before they wrote. So there was always that sort of, like, cycle that we went through. So I think that really helped them be strong writers, which is something that is often, can be really challenging for English learners.
That's so, I know we've talked about all of this stuff before, but, like, I'm now thinking of it from, like, an English learner perspective. If you're thinking, like, today we're reading about bees to find the main idea, and tomorrow we're going to read about something else.
Right.
And then we're going to do writing totally separately, because we're going to learn how to, like, write out, like, order of operations. So we're going to, how do you make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? And like, I can imagine, like, if you don't know what any of these things are in English,
exactly,
just how confusing it would be, versus, like, actually helping to make sense of things because everything's connected and day-to-day connected, and you're going deeper. And wow. I hadn't thought about it for our English learners. Like that.
No, it really helps. Like, one of my students in 8th grade, oh man, he got so into the World War I unit. And that's, like, a perfect example.
I always
of,
think,
like,
it's funny, but it
right. I know. I was like, oh, this is dark. This book is long. This book is hard. But he was like, oh my gosh, he was into it in the Socratics, like, talking more than anyone else, like, about whether war destroys your humanity. Are you really a person after you've been to war? Like, he was just so into it. And so, like, to really give him time to think about that. And then that's what he's expected to write about. So it's like, it also, like, if you think cognitive load with writing, which is what you're saying there, Melissa, like, he has his ideas. So, so he can get those out. So he actually kind of has he can focus a little bit on, like, the English, like, how am I trying to say this? Because English learners are, like, balancing so many things at once when they're trying to speak and then to write. I mean, that's just, like, such another layer, that they're adding on. So that was super powerful. And the art was another thing that I always loved with my kids, because, and this works for lots of kids, but such a way to talk about art is just different, but it's such a way to let everybody do that, right? Like, it kind of takes the words out for a second, and you can just have these, like, amazing thoughts, right, that you could share in any language, right? If you can talk to peers in different languages and just have, practice having some really rich conversations and making connections. So that was a great opportunity too.
Yeah, that's a good point. When I was working with a school district that has a dual language program, depending, they were trying to figure out how this would look in terms of wit and wisdom implementation. And a lot of the time they ended up doing the art in whichever language the text was not available in, if that makes any sense. It's a lot to process.
Got it.
So for example, if the text was available and the core text was available in Spanish, then they went on and did the art in English, or vice versa. And that was really helpful because the students could then all have that experience together. And they knew that they were meeting the dual language specifications and being able to meet the needs of all students, but also give them access to all of these texts and experiences that the curriculum demanded. So that was really helpful. And that's a good point to mention, students that does, level the playing field and give them equity and experience. The art is a big, big deal.
And it's really powerful to be able to process content in both places, right? Anywhere, in any language that you learn something, it's just in your head, right? If you learn something in Spanish, you don't have to relearn it in English. You just might need, new words, but you have those ideas, and then it really strengthens if you're able to bridge between the languages. It's really helps deepen your understanding of whatever you're talking about.
Yeah. I feel like we could keep talking all day.
I know.
All right. So we may do a follow-up podcast.
I would love that.
In the interim, would you share one final piece of advice with our listeners?
Yes, definitely. And so I was thinking about this a little bit, what is my advice? But there is this quote, I'll see on Twitter or, it pops up different places that always just makes me stop and think. And it's when people say the most dangerous phrase in the English language is, but this is the way we've always done it. And it just always makes me, think about this whole journey that a lot of us have been on in education and to not be afraid to change. Right. And that we want what's best for our kids. And, like I said, some of our kids really can't advocate for themselves for whatever reasons. And so, we can't be afraid to stand up and say to whoever is in charge, is this really the best way to do this? Right. Just make sure that we use our voices, as educators, this is how we be activists, right? To just stand up and recognize that getting good reading curriculum into our schools, it will change the world. Not to be over dramatic, but it really could change things if we are able to just raise literacy rates for all of our kiddos.
Yeah,
absolutely.
We totally agree. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for having me. This was wonderful.
Yeah. Sarah, I'll link some of your very famous blog pieces in our show notes as well.
So that everybody can famous.
Read. Yeah. And they'll see your picture. You'll see your picture on the blog post too.
Yeah. With Joanna Gaines, right?
Well, thank you so much. It was so much fun talking with you, and we hope to talk to you again soon.
All right. Thank you guys.
Bye.
Bye.